Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Boutell. I am the CTO at Apostrophe Technologies. We make an all JavaScript CMS. Kind of great if you want to write JavaScript all day. So I write JavaScript all day. So that's my clever segue into the topic of my talk, which is ES6 and beyond, modern JavaScript. A chance to talk about what modern JavaScript can do for us that was difficult or painful in older versions of JavaScript, not to put too fine a point on it. And usually when I give this talk, I stop more with questions about what the room is used to and so forth. And I welcome questions, and I'll even try to look at the questions too as the talk goes on, because that's how I roll. But I also understand this is a different format. So if I don't see questions being typed in, that's cool. Also, I believe I've unmuted everyone, so I will pause after slides and ask if folks have anything they'd like to touch on a little bit more. So I'm going to start by talking about the most basic ES6 JavaScript, modern JavaScript thing, and yet really one of the very best, which is the let keyword. Let versus var. We all remember var, unless we were lucky enough to come up relatively recently. Var was the old bad way of declaring variables in JavaScript. And var has many terrible problems. And the key problem with var is that it does not have block scoping. So this code here is going to have an unexpected result. You might think that when we get to the end here, cat will still be Lewis, because here inside the loop, we declare a whole new var. Well, it doesn't work like that. You only get one scope for your var. And not only that, it will lie to you, because you can use the word var again. And yet it really is the same variable again. So it's just not a good language feature. It's something we've all learned to live with. To be fair to var, if this was a nested function, we wouldn't have this problem, which is how people worked around it, most often using libraries like Lodash and so on. And we'll be talking about some of the reasons and why you don't need underscore or Lodash so much with modern JavaScript. So if I run this little program, we get loopycat 1 through 10, and then loopycat 10 again, which, as I said, it's a bit of an unexpected result. You'd think it would still be Lewis, but because there's only one var, it gets overwritten by this last one. So boo on that. So I'm going to go ahead and show the modern way of doing this using let instead of var. Let is similar to var. If you only want to learn one new thing, it's replace all your vars with let, and it'll probably do what you always wanted it to do. I say that because look at this. We have let cat equal Lewis. We have our for loop with the let declared in line here. This variable only exists inside this for loop, which is very nice. It doesn't argue with any other I that might be floating around up there. And this cat inside the for loop exists only inside this block, this pass of the for loop. It will not interfere with the outer cat. If I'm declaring a variable, I have a reasonable expectation that that darn thing is declared. And if there's some kind of conflict, that the language will tell me. With let, we don't have a conflict. We simply have a separate scope for the variable inside that for loop. So when I hit run, I get what I was expecting. I get 10 loopy cats and 1 Lewis. Lewis, by the way, is a very, very large cat who lives in Jersey City, and you'll get to see him at the end of the talk. Any questions about let versus var? Okay, I'll go ahead. So moving on from let to const. Const is a little bit trickier to explain in the way it works in JavaScript, or rather, it's trickier to explain how it's beneficial. But let me take you through what it actually does. So I'm going to start with a little program here where we have a cat variable, and then we assign, and we go ahead, we make the cat, we pet the cat, then we make a brand new cat, and it is assigned to that same variable, which is something that you can do with a regular variable. And then we're going to go ahead and make another Lewis, which in this case was something, let's say the developer didn't intend to do this. Well, they could be a little bit surprised that they weren't told, that they'd made a mistake by making a second copy of Lewis. But since we're just assigning to the same variable, we really can't tell that we've reused anything because that's the behavior of variables. They're literally variable. So we are going to have that odd result of the third cat being allowed. Now, if I look at what this looks like with const gives us clarity about what's going I am, by using const, I'm saying I will never assign a new value to this thing. It will always remain a constant. I almost said variable. And the value of that is that if we name our constants intelligently, then we will be made aware of things. Like if I try to make a second Lewis, it's going to tell me, hey, you just told me that Lewis is a constant. You can't declare him again. Now, I could, if I left off the const here, it would still throw an error because, again, the point is that it's constant. It cannot be redeclared. It cannot be assigned to. If I was in a nested scope, like a nested function or a for loop, then I could make it as a separate, another const, but that would be a different nested constant, and the old one would still exist in the outer scope. So when I run this, I'm going to get an error that I'm happy about. I'm going to get an error reminding me that I already made a Lewis. And if I'm using const like this, that's the kind of information that I want the language to give me. So I should be happy about that. By the way, if you play with these slides later and you're wondering like where the cat constructor for the cat class is and so on, I do have this little more button in the deck, so you can see the boring details like the cat class and so forth, and play around with those when you see fit. Any questions about const? All right, guys, I'll go ahead to ES6 classes. Now, I will run up the flag here and admit I'm not a big fan of inheritance, of prototypal inheritance, JavaScript inheritance in general, because of the way this can be a really awkward keyword to work with. But this isn't to talk about this. So I'm going to concentrate on how ES6 classes do give us a nice familiar syntax for things that feel weird and very JavaScript specific and strange before you have ES6. So this is the old awkward way of making something akin to a Java class or a PHP class in JavaScript. You would have to have a constructor function. And once you have one of these, you can say new cat. And you would then, in order to attach methods that can be called on each cat, you would have to assign them to cat.prototype. At least ES5 or later, you can do this, and then you would be able to do what you wanted to do and refer to the current object as this. That is the magic that you get by constructing an object. Although I will say that if you do something asynchronous inside here, or if you do something with a library that takes functions as arguments, pass it a method, you'll get some very unexpected results. So just watch out for that. But so if I go ahead and make my cat, I'm able to hear him purr, but I had to write some code that might feel a little strange. And although this part isn't totally strange, when you bring inheritance into it, which I didn't show in this slide, it definitely looks strange. You have to take a lot of extra steps just to extend a class. So let's look at what that's like in ES6 JavaScript. In ES6 JavaScript, I get to write code that if you've ever worked in Python or written a PHP class, or really worked in almost any object-oriented language, you will find familiar and comfortable, and your blood pressure will drop steadily as you look at it. Here, I'm using a good old class keyword like we've all seen before. I write a function called constructor to do any assignments that I want to do at the time the object is made, and I can write a method in line right here inside this class. I also do not have a comma here. And this is like a little thing, but it's a nice thing. For the class keyword, the designers of ES6 recognized that it was clearly going to consist of methods. And so there was no reason why there had to be a comma between the methods. And this, again, looks more like familiar programming languages. And so I'm able to do exactly the same thing that I could do before, but with less code and more readable code. And I didn't do inheritance here, but if you want to extend a class, you just use the extend keyword, much as you would in other languages, and you're not thinking out loud about prototype chains. I will mention that what actually happens under the hood is exactly the same as the old way of doing prototypal inheritance in JavaScript, which means that you can use ES6 classes to extend classes or prototypes that were written with ES5 and vice versa. So that is interchangeable, and they do work the same way. If you're using something like Babel, which you've probably heard of. It's a JavaScript compiler that transpiles code from modern JavaScript down to ES5, so it will still run in dum-to-dum, IE11, the one thing that we all have to deal with day to day that is still on ES5. It actually converts it down to prototypal JavaScript with no problems. Any questions about classes in ES6? All right, I'll move along. So let's have a look at the next slide. Cool. So let's talk about arrow functions. Now, these are functional programmer candy. This is the wordy way, not bad way, because this code is hardly terrible. It's very readable. But this is kind of the wordy ES5 plus way of doing it. I say ES5 plus because for each is a little bit on the modern side as a method of arrays, but it does exist in most implementations of JavaScript. And what this does is I have to pass a function to for each, and then for each cat, it will be able to operate on that cat and do something. If I go to the modern way of doing this, then it gets really short because I can pass an arrow function to for each. An arrow function is just like a regular classic JavaScript function, but there are a few simplifications. One is that if there's just one argument, I don't have to have any parens here at all. If there's more than one argument for that function, by the way, then I would have parens and I'd separate them with commas. Also, if there are 0 arguments, you would just have empty parens here. The second thing is that after the little arrow, if there is just one statement, just one expression in this function, I don't need any curly braces, which is cool. And also, although I didn't utilize this feature here, if there is just one expression, the value of that expression is returned. It's as if I used the return keyword, which is extremely cool. So you can write some really pithy, really short code that feels more like something in Ruby, something in a more sleek and sophisticated modern language. We now have that for ourselves, which is great. And when I run that, I get exactly the same result. So let's take a look at, there's one more thing I should mention about arrow functions. They don't have a this. And what does that mean? It doesn't really matter. What it means is that you can't use them as methods. But more than likely, you're writing ES6 classes anyway, and you're going to use this little method syntax, which declares a regular old school function. Okay. Any questions about arrow functions? All right, I'll move ahead. Okay, let's talk about AsyncAwait. Now, AsyncAwait is a pretty sophisticated feature for dealing with a pretty gross problem that we all suffered with mightily in ES5. And that problem is callbacks. No, psych, I'm not even going to talk about callbacks because callbacks have already been obsoleted by promises, and no tears shed for callbacks. So I'm not going to give yet another example of how people used to try to write asynchronous code with callbacks. But I will mention what asynchronous programming is. Asynchronous programming in JavaScript is anytime the thing won't happen right away. And by not right away, I mean it will happen when an event takes place, like a click, or it'll happen when time passes, like with set timeout, or it will happen when something is fetched from the network, like with fetch, let's say. And in modern-ish code, we tend to explicitly write what are called promise chains. So you may recognize, I'm calling an imaginary API here called reverse that will go ahead and reverse the letters in the name of the cat, which of course is a very complicated operation. We can't do it here in the browser. We have to send it to a server somewhere. Okay, I'm stretching, but you get the idea. And then I'm going to chain the next function after that using then. This is how we used to get our async programming chains flattened out using promises in ES5. It is readable, but it is not writable. It is very verbose. Yes, I know you have VS Code snippets for it, but it's still very verbose stuff. And that would get us through, and we'd be able to do one thing at a time as well, which is difficult in async programming, unlike regular programming, in that we can make this API call, then make another API call, then make another, and so on. And at the end, we can do something that looks a lot like catching an exception in, I would almost say, other languages. There's always been exception handling in JavaScript, but we've all been trained out of ever using it. But this is just like try-catch in other languages. And the point is that it will catch all the errors that might be either thrown inside one of these functions, as long as they happen right here in this synchronous function, or a promise that's rejected, like an error from the API function. Now that's a little bit of a mouthful. Any questions about this example before I show you the funky modern version? You can see how these spool out slowly because they're coming from a faraway server. All right, so I'll go ahead and take a look at the modern version of that. Okay, so this is the readable way. Just look at it. I mean, I don't think I have to convince anyone that this language feature is an improvement. A really good question that was asked of me last time is, are all these features worth it? I mean, there's a learning curve to learn about these features. Are they worth it? Just about every feature that I chose to include in this deck, I think is hella worth it, at least to the extent it's worth it if you use the thing that it's designed for. Like, I don't love JavaScript classes, but if you use them, you definitely want to write them the new way. And almost all the other features are slam dunks, but especially AsyncAwait. So what does AsyncAwait do? It allows us to write code that waits for a promise to resolve without actually having to write promise code ourselves. We don't have to write .then and chain a function and so on and so forth. All we have to do is say await, but otherwise like write really normal, really flat, really linear looking code that we can read and maintain and think about. And the only key to get into this await paradise is that our function must be declared async. When you do that, your function will return a promise, just like all these functions that it's awaiting. But you don't have to say that. You don't have to construct a promise. You don't have to chain anything. It just happens automatically. And for this reason, it also goes both ways. If you have an older library that's written using plain old promises, and you want to await a function that's exported by that library, that will work perfectly. Similarly, if in an older project you want to require some code from a new project that uses AsyncAwait, and you want to just chain it with then, you may do that as well. Oh, I think someone's phone is ringing. You might want to take a quick peek at that. All right. Cool. So if we go ahead and run this, it runs exactly like the other. The difference is that this code, this implementation of our API, I kept my old API function just to show that we can use await together with something that uses promises the hard way. I wrote this little promise-based thing that uses set timeout to slowly reverse the string, but I can await all of these calls because of the fact that AsyncAwait is able to await anything that returns a promise. Any questions about AsyncAwait? Okay, cool. I'll move on. So let's talk about what happens when you want to iterate over lots of things and do it using something like an API, a database, a REST API, anything. This is one of the things that it was nastiest before we had promises. Even with promises, we had to use promise.all, or else use a library that introduced ways of saying, okay, I want this, but I only want to process 2 at a time, or 3 at a time, or 1 at a time. The only thing that's built into promises, like they're delivered in a web browser, or is promise.all, where you can make a bunch of promises in an array, which, by the way, remember, this API returns a promise. So what I'm doing with this map here is I'm turning all these cats into promises for reversed cats. That sentence hurts my brain, so it's okay if it hurts your brain. And so now promise.all will await all of those promises before then is invoked, and we're able to see all of our reversed cats. However, this first example works because there's just 2 cats. But I've introduced a nuance, a little wrinkle here, which is I've said my API has a rate limit. Now, I don't have to ask if you've ever encountered a rate limit, if you've ever worked with third-party services and found out that you can't pelt them with 100 requests for 100 things at a time. They are going to limit you to maybe 2 or 3 things at a time, or maybe even 2 or 3 things per second, and so on. And you're going to need to have some ability to show restraint. So promise.all is not the way to go in a lot of different situations. So in this case, I try to send 3 cats through the API at once, and that is going to fail, and I'm going to wind up rate limited in this catch handler here. So why did I wind up in that catch handler? If we take a look at the rest of my code, I updated this one so that it implements a rate limit for this API. So now we're going to see how with modern ES6 JavaScript, we can write a much simpler version of this code that respects the rate limit and never runs into that. And we will do that using my very favorite feature, I think maybe altogether, of modern JavaScript, even though it's a teeny tiny thing. And we did see it once before on an earlier slide. I'm going to use plain old cat of three cats. I'm going to use plain old of to iterate in my for of loop here. And because I'm inside an async function, I can use await inside the loop body. When we first became aware of AsyncAwait, we didn't think it would be this easy to solve this particular problem. But when we realized around the office that with for of and await combined, you could get things to happen dun, 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 one at a time, we were very excited because one at a time is a really great way to do things in most situations. If you are writing, as we are, if you're writing code that responds to a web request, and you have lots and lots and lots of web requests coming in, you have lots of parallelism happening already because your 1,000 people who are hitting your server at once are making it do 1,000 things at once. You don't need to do the party trick of having your own web request for each individual request. You don't need to process 1,000 things at once in that request. And in fact, you're just going to run into rate limits of some kind when you do. So we are big fans of using plain old for of to solve this kind of problem and get to an answer successfully without hitting that rate limit this time. There are libraries that give you ways to say, hey, you know what? Okay, I don't want to run 1,000 things at once, but I know I can run 5 at once. And I really want to do that because these are slow things. You can do that with, among other things, the Bluebird promise library, which is worth checking out. It's a nice drop-in replacement for promises. It supports a promise.map method that you can pass a concurrency argument to. And what that does is it lets you say, I only want to do so many of these at a time, which is pretty elegant. Any questions about AsyncAwait and for of? All right, cool. Well, let's go on. Alrighty, so object literal shorthand. This is another fave of mine. This example is short, so it doesn't entirely do justice to how obnoxious this can feel sometimes. How often do you make an object where the property has the same name as the variable you're stuffing into that property? Pretty often. I mean, it's a really frequent occurrence, and it works just fine, but it's irritating. So let's take a look at what happens when we use modern JavaScript to lift that irritation. We're going to use the object literal shorthand. It's just one tiny change. We can just write cat in these curlies. And when we do that, that's equivalent to writing cat : cat. And I just said cat a lot of times, which kind of conveys the way you feel when you're typing these objects that are made up of variables that are already right in front of you. And this really does add some elegance there. You can also mix and match. You can have a comma after this and then have a property whose value is not a variable with the same name. And that's fine. And you can integrate those together in the same code. Works great and really cuts down on the verbiage. So REST arguments are another undersung feature of, and when I say ES6 and beyond, it's because I have fatigue talking about ES7, ES 2015, ES 2017, but I think these came in ES 2015 or so. Certainly back to Node 8 is how I measure the world. I couldn't tell you what version of Chrome exactly that would be. You're probably using Babel anyway. But when we use the REST operator, like this. This is the old version. So in ES5, if I want to get the rest of the arguments, any extra arguments after message, I have to write the crunchiest boilerplate known to man. I have to do this dance. I know what this does. I'm not proud of that. I'm not, but I've actually stared at it enough times that I have to stop saying I don't know what it does, but only because I wrote this deck. So that's a thing that I used to have to try to remember every time that I did it. It's very inelegant. And I still write some ES5, which is something that's going away very quickly, thankfully, in my life. So if I wanted to get the arguments after the first argument, then I had to grab that special arguments variable, which, by the way, we don't see it declared here, but this is all the arguments of your function. It's magic JavaScript word that means all the arguments of your function. It's not an array, though. So I have to use the slice method of the array prototype to slice it and get it as if it had been, it's too awful to continue. But once I have that, I can join my messages together and output them, even though I called with more arguments than I had declared here. So now let's look at what this looks like in ES 2015. Whoa, man, whoa, that's just way nicer. So I can just write ... messages. And what that does is that takes any additional arguments, 0 is an acceptable number, by the way, and it puts them in an array for me. And I can just join that array or do whatever I want with that array. And all of that arguments and slice.call.monkey nonsense is just gone forever. It's a beautiful thing. Any questions about REST? Alrighty, I will move on. So let's talk about template strings. Template strings are a lovely feature of ES6 that lets us write long strings without a whole lot of plus signs. And it lets us write multi-line strings, which is an even bigger win. Now, here's my old version. I'm just going to take all these messages and I'm going to join them. I'm going to add them together into a string, and I'm going to use lots of plus signs, have a lot of readability issues there. It works, but it's a pain. So let's look at the modernized version. Okay, now we can just stuff variables in the middle of our string, as long as we use these backticks. And you can also, if you want to, I didn't do it here, and I wouldn't recommend overdoing it, but you can put any valid JavaScript code inside here. You're not restricted just to a variable name. So you can put whatever you like in there, and it just leads to much more readable strings. Now, I did not, in this particular example, show a multi-line string, but if I want to drop a line break here and type, and drop a line break and so on, and eventually close it with a closing backtick, that works. With classic strings, if you do that, you do not get a valid string. If you do it with backticks, then you actually get those line breaks in the string. And of course, in HTML, we know that means they're just treated as spaces, which can come in pretty handy. So it really is a more elegant way of interpolating things in strings. My recommendation, if you, like me, have been doing this for mumble years, is to just make a clean break and use backticks all the time if you can. I think that it's the best way, and it'll help you move on from being trapped in plus land if you just make a clean break with it. Any questions about backticks? Okay, cool. Alrighty, so we are going to come back to that ... There's a completely different application of ... and yet not so different. You'll see how it's similar and why it makes sense to use the same syntax. So here's the problem with old JavaScript that we are hoping to solve. The old way of dealing with defaults for properties. Let's say that I'm writing a function called API, and it takes a data object, and that can take various properties, and they all have default values. If I don't supply that property, something reasonable should happen. Well, in classic ES5 JavaScript, this is a little bit of a pain. I can just say or. This won't work for me very well if the name of my cat is the literal number 0. Okay, the name of your cat is probably not the literal number 0. But if it is, on the other hand, a property called priority, that could easily be 0, and 0 could be a value that I intended to write. And so I would find myself writing something like this: data.priority is not equal to undefined, question mark. The ternary operator, our old friend, will pull out that value as long as it's not undefined. Otherwise, I can safely default to 1. And of course, that is that's the only way that I can get through that and make sure that all of my defaults behave reasonably. That way, like, I get the right result for when there's no cat. I get the right result when there's no priority, or when there's a priority of 0, and so forth. Now let's look at what this is like with this new object spread operator. I think you'll see why it's groovy. Okay, so this guy spreads like butter. This is the original object, or sorry, this is our object that we're going to work with. Here are our defaults for both of our properties, and now we are going to spread in the data object. When we say dot dot data, what we mean is take all the properties of data and smush them into this object right here. So, and that will only take properties that exist in data. So if data literally has no property for cat, for instance, then it won't smush. So this is a really graceful way to deal with object defaults or property defaults. It is far from the only use for this. You'll see it a lot if you're a React programmer. You'll see it a lot when you're working with stores and reducers. It's a really elegant way to write those. Comes up in lots of contexts, but this is one of my favorite examples. Any questions about the spread operator? Okay, cool. I am magically leveling everyone up, or everyone already knows everything. Either one of those situations is good for all of us. Cool. Alrighty, now let's talk about unspreading a little bit, or object literal assignment. This is closer to what we were doing with the REST arguments feature earlier. So let's talk about what happens when we're only interested in one property of an object, or just a few properties of an object that's going to be returned by something. The old way was you would get that object returned to you, and then you would just have to pull out that property. And this, in this trivial example, doesn't seem like a big deal, but it means you'd have to write a lot more variable declarations here to individually pull them out of the info variable. But if we look at the modern way of doing this, we can write, again, we can use this cool syntax that looks like and has a nice poetry with, a nice symmetry with the condensed object literals we saw before. I am assigning, this looks like I'm assigning to an object literal. What the hell does that do? Well, what it does is it actually makes variables with each of these property names. I could have name, comma, and then additional property names if I wanted. And name will be equal to the name property of the object that came back here. So it'll be equal to Lewis in this case. So this can be really elegant, especially if you're dealing with something like you're requiring a module and you're only interested in one of the things that it exports. There's more you can do with that, of course, with ES6 modules, which are a little out of scope for today's talk. But if you're requiring something old school in Node, you'll certainly find it very useful. Cool. Now, let's talk also about passing options by name. Now, JavaScript does not have a feature to pass options by name, or to pass arguments by name, right? That's something you might have seen in a few other languages, but there is a new feature that makes it easier to fake it. So the classic way of faking it in JavaScript is to write this. We have an options argument, and you'd have a big old comment documenting the properties, because options is meant to be an object, and we can give it a style property, and we can pass terse as the value. And okay, so now we've managed to express that we want, our return value to be expressed a little bit more tersely with just a comma. Now, what happens? And incidentally, as for when you should do this, I'm of the opinion that you should do this pretty often if your function is getting past 3 arguments, or if you're pretty sure that most of the additional arguments you're going to wish you had are not any less important than the ones you've already got. It's probably time to refactor and have an options object for the stuff that would otherwise just get out of hand, where you'd have to memorize more than 3 arguments, which most developers will not do. But let's go ahead and look at how we can do this gracefully with unspreading. Okay, now this is slick. This is self-documenting, or very near it. Rather than having an options object here, we have what looks, again, like an object literal, but what we're doing is we're saying that the object you pass here, its style property, will get turned into an argument called style inside the function. And that is just really elegant. It cuts down on all that options dot boilerplate. As I said, it's very self-documenting style. And then from the developer standpoint, it is exactly the same. They call it exactly the same way they would. Otherwise, they're still making an object literal. It's just a lot more graceful. Any questions about unspreading arguments? Okay, cool. So, and by the way, if there's some issue by which I'm not hearing questions, then my apologies in advance. So far, I don't think I've heard any. All right, so let's talk about default values for arguments. The old way of doing this was to be very careful and watch out for undefined. So to be very express about it, so you know that that argument was explicitly skipped or just not passed. If you were to just write not message, you would get tripped up when message was literally equal to the number 0, which in some situations is a very valid message to send. So that's something that you had to handle in a bit of a verbose way. But in ES 2015 plus 1 zillion, we can write, yeah, just look at it. You can just assign a default value in the function declaration. And so now when I run, I'm going to get that same result. If I don't pass an argument, I'll get meow. Otherwise, I'll get the argument that I passed. And again, it's self-documenting. Comments are good, but self-documenting code is better, much better. This is a pretty good example of it. So this is another example of a feature that I'm very on board with. This one is maybe less confusing to look at, whereas this one, the first time I saw it, it freaked me out for about a minute. But after that minute, I was really happy. So I would encourage you to sit with it for the number of minutes that it requires for you to be happy as well, because there's a lot of value there. I believe I added one more slide. Let me see if I can grab that guy. Ah, there we go. Okay, I did add one more slide about accessing stuff that might not exist. This is, let me set the stage for you, okay? You have an array of messages. Every message has a speaker, probably, and has the speaker has a name, let's say definitely, but they might have a job, and they might have a job title. You're not sure. Now, if you want to write bug-free JavaScript to deal with this, you have to find a way of poking through to the right property without crashing if that property doesn't exist. There are libraries that do this. Lodash solves many of the problems that are covered in this deck without using new language features. In some cases, fairly elegantly, like _.get is not terrible at all, but you got to drag in a library for it, and the performance, at least in the long run, probably won't be as good as the native language feature. So here's what we get with this solution. But in this solution, we get what we would expect. It behaves gracefully and doesn't crash if we have no job title. But let's look at the code we had to write to do that. And this is a fairly common ES5 solution to it. We make sure this exists and this exists because we know that JavaScript will shortcut execution. If this is falsy, it won't go on to this. It'll just, because it's an and, it'll just go ahead and return the value of this, return false, and so on and so on. And that way we don't crash. But this can get really long. If you've written this 5 steps long, you know my pain. Now let's look at the modern way of doing it. And this is extremely new. This is called optional chaining. This, to my surprise, as of today, exists in all the modern browsers. And it also, I believe it exists in the latest stable LTS version of Node as well. It is called optional chaining, and it lets us just write this. Now that question mark dot, again, it might take you a moment, but just think of it as maybe dot, and you should be in good shape. And what that does is that is going to stop and return the first falsy thing it runs into. It's just like that chain of ands with the repetition, but without all that repetition. So it really makes your code much more readable. I find it elegant to be a good solution to the problem. Any questions about optional, what are we calling it? Optional chaining? Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on to my next to final slide, which is my lovely thank you slide featuring, and I already spoiled the surprise for you, Lewis the cat. Lewis the cat is very large. I don't know what Lewis the cat weighs, unfortunately. I should learn that, and I should have that information prepared for the next version of this talk. But at the moment, I do not have that information handy. What I do have is a few words about the CMS I mentioned in the beginning. This is apostrophe CMS. There was a talk about it earlier. This is what I work on all day. And we are an all JavaScript company. We write all JavaScript on the front end and on the back end, thanks to Node.js. That's why we're so passionate about it. I recommend that you check it out if you get a chance and are curious about what it's like to live a life where you don't have to switch gears between PHP and JavaScript and so forth. I think you'll enjoy it, and thanks for giving that a look. Cool. So any questions, thoughts, small furry animals?
I have a question. So you have mentioned browser support a couple of times,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the fact that we often have to accommodate for folks who are using like older versions of Internet Explorer or something like
Mm-hmm.
that has prevented us from using ES6 in the
Mm-hmm.
past, or at least it's prevented me from using it.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know, if there's a way to get around that, if there's a way that
Uh-huh.
I can still use error functions without having to
Yeah.
worry about it? Great, thanks.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the short answer is Babel. Babel is a utility that you can install, you can npm install that compiles modern JavaScript down to ES5, down to IE11 compatible. It can do many tricks, but that's the most common application of it. And Babel is usually found in the context of Webpack, but you do not have to use Webpack to use Babel. And I'm not bashing Webpack, which is a great tool, but if you're in a situation maybe where you haven't kind of Webpackified your whole world yet, and all you want to do is run your JavaScript through something that makes it safe for old browsers, that's how you do that. There are also, when you read in the Babel documentation, you'll see that there are also some libraries that you might need, depending on the language feature you want. Some language features, for instance, ES6 classes, or I believe arrow functions, you can just translate them to ES5, and that's it. That's kind of it. They have an ES5 equivalent. Others, like promises, require that you have a promises library in your build, so watch out for that. You might need appropriate polyfills, and there are one of the simplest ways to do that. There are some third-party services. I think polyfill.io, if I remember properly, is one of the lowest barrier to entry approaches for getting all the polyfills that your customers need and not getting the polyfills that your customers don't. It's worth exploring so that you also have the library end of it, and you can write that await call and actually have a promise library on the other end to pick up the phone. Is that helpful?
That's extremely helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. It's a really good question. Any others?
Yeah, I have one. Is there any plans for any of the browsers to go straight to ES6 instead of using stuff like Babel or any of these compression tools
Yes.
nowadays?
Mm-hmm. Yes, 100% of modern browsers, and that includes Edge. Even before Edge transitioned to kind of be a version of WebKit or a version of Chrome anyway, 100% of the modern browsers will run almost every example I showed you. The only one that I would double check your browser maybe is the optional chaining. But when I glanced at the Can I Use page really fast earlier today, in fact, let's have a little fun here and go look at that. Hang on, if I can type. Let's see here. Now, okay, I couldn't quite get that open just now. But if you Google for Can I Use, you'll find a service that lets you check any individual JavaScript feature to see if it exists yet in your browser's choice. And also the Microsoft Developer Network documentation, not Microsoft, sorry, the Mozilla Developer Network documentation, the Firefox docs, covers the language compatibility of the browser compatibility of all these new features really well. That was a good question too. Any others? Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for coming, and I hope you got something out of it. Hope you get a chance to check out Apostrophe, and I will make sure that I drop a link to the slides in the Slack immediately afterwards. Thanks, everyone.